In naval aviation, there are old pilots and bold pilots, but no old bold pilots. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was about to learn why. The USS Constellation cut through Pacific swells 200 miles west of San Diego, her nuclear heart pushing 95,000 tons of American steel through increasingly rough seas. What had started as routine training was turning into something else entirely. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood on the flight deck, watching the horizon disappear into gray. The weather briefing had called for scattered showers and moderate winds. Reality was 30-foot swells, gusting crosswinds, and a storm system intensifying faster than predicted. "Looks like we're in for a ride," said Lieutenant Commander Sarah Viper Chen, the squadron's most experienced pilot. At 34, she logged over 2,000 carrier landings and seen weather that would ground civilian airports. But even she looked concerned watching the deck crew double-check tie-down chains. Jake nodded, hiding his nervousness. At 26, he was the squadron's newest pilot with exactly 47 carrier landings. Today's exercise was supposed to be routine. Combat air patrol followed by field carrier landing practice. Nothing he hadn't done dozens of times, except he'd never done it in conditions like this. "Storm's building faster than forecast," Viper said, checking her kneeboard. "We might be looking at the last recovery of the day." Jake felt his stomach tighten. The last recovery was every naval aviator's nightmare. The final chance to get aboard before weather turned the carrier deck into a bucking bronco no pilot could safely land on. "How bad can it get?" Jake asked. Viper looked at him with the expression of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be taught in flight school. "Bad enough that we'll find out what you're really made of." At 14:30 hours, Jake strapped into his FA-18 Super Hornet, call sign Rebel 204. The aircraft was a technological marvel, 40,000 pounds of fighter jet capable of speeds over Mach 1.8, bristling with sensors and weapon systems. But right now, it was just a machine that needed to get back to this deck in one piece. Pre-flight checks were routine, but Jake found himself double-checking everything. The catapult officer gave Jake the traditional thumbs up. Jake returned the gesture, then braced himself. The catapult fired. In 2.5 seconds, Jake went from 0 to 165 miles per hour. The acceleration pressed him back with crushing force. Then suddenly he was airborne, climbing into the gray Pacific sky. For 90 minutes, Jake flew a textbook training mission. He practiced intercepts, ran simulated attacks, and executed formation flying with precision. The storm was building, but from 20,000 feet it looked manageable. It wasn't until he began descent for carrier landing that Jake realized how much things had changed. "Rebel 204, this is Constellation approach. Be advised we're experiencing moderate to severe turbulence. Winds gusting 35 knots with frequent direction changes. Deck is moving plus or minus 15 feet. Jake's mouth went dry. 15-foot deck movement meant the carrier was pitching and rolling like a cork in a bathtub. Landing on a stable deck was challenging enough. Landing on a moving target in a storm was something else entirely. As Jake entered the landing pattern, he could see the Constellation far below, her deck lights barely visible through rain and spray. The ship looked impossibly small, a tiny rectangle surrounded by endless gray ocean. "Rebel 204, call the ball," came the landing signal officer's voice. Jake lined up for approach, fighting turbulence that tried to throw his aircraft off course. "Rebel 204, Super Hornet, 4.2. "Roger, ball. You're looking good. Fly through the burble." As he descended through 300 feet, turbulence hit like a sledgehammer. His aircraft bucked and rolled, the nose pitching despite his attempts to control it. The carrier deck, barely visible through rain, seemed to move in 3 dimensions at once. "Power, power," called the LSO. Jake added throttle, but the aircraft was behind the power curve. The deck was coming up fast, but he was too high and too fast. At the last second, he realized he wasn't going to make it. Wave off," he called, pushing throttles to full power. The Super Hornet climbed away from the deck, engines screaming in full afterburner. Jake had missed his first approach. Rebel 204, that was a good wave off, came Viper's voice over the radio. Weather's getting worse. You've got one more shot before we go to red deck. Jake's fuel gauge showed 2,800 pounds, enough for one more approach with minimal reserve. If he missed this one, he'd have to divert to North Island, assuming he could make it through the storm. As he turned back toward the ship, Jake could see deck crews scrambling to secure loose equipment. The seas were building, and the Constellation was riding them like a roller coaster. Rebel 204, approach. Be advised, winds now gusting 40 knots. Variable direction. Deck moving plus or minus 20 feet. You're cleared for approach. 20 feet of deck movement. Jake had never landed in conditions this severe. He turned final, lining up with the carrier's angled deck. The Fresnel lens, the meatball, glowed amber in the gray afternoon, his only visual reference in the chaos. Rebel 204, call the ball. Rebel 204, Super Hornet 2.2. Roger ball, you're slightly high, on center line. Watch your lineup. At 200 feet, turbulence hit again. His aircraft rolled left, then right, the nose pitching up and down. Jake fought the controls, but the storm was winning. You're low power, called the LSO. Jake added power, but not enough. At the last second, he saw the round down rushing toward him. Wave off, he called again, going to full power. But this time, something was wrong. The left engine didn't respond. Jake felt the aircraft yaw right as asymmetric thrust tried to roll him inverted. Rebel 204, you've got a left engine malfunction, came Viper's voice. Your engine's on fire. Jake's training kicked in. Left engine fire, potentially catastrophic. He ran through the emergency checklist, shutting down the burning engine and configuring for single-engine operation. The FA-18 was capable of flying on one engine, but landing on a carrier deck in a storm with only half his power was something else entirely. His fuel was down to 1,800 pounds, barely enough for one more approach. Rebel 204, state your intentions, came the air boss's voice. Jake looked at his instruments. One engine shut down, fuel critically low, weather deteriorating, but below the deck crew was preparing for emergency recovery. Rebel 204 is declaring an emergency, single engine, low fuel, requesting immediate recovery. Roger, Rebel 204. You're cleared for immediate approach. Fire crews are standing by. Jake turned back toward the ship, his single engine straining to maintain airspeed. The aircraft felt sluggish, unresponsive. Rebel 204, this is Viper. I'm going to talk you down. You've got this. Listen to me, Viper's voice came through clearly. Single-engine approaches are about energy management. You've got less power, so you need to be more precise. Jake acknowledged, fighting to keep the aircraft stable as he descended toward the pitching deck. Start your approach a little higher than normal. You won't have the power to correct if you get low. Trust your training. Trust your aircraft. As Jake entered the groove, he could see the carrier's deck rising and falling in the swells. The landing area looked impossibly small. Rebel 204, call the ball. Rebel 204, Super Hornet, emergency single engine, 1.2. Roger ball, emergency single engine. You're looking good, on center line. Jake fought the crosswind, making small corrections as the aircraft descended. The single engine was doing its job, but he could feel the aircraft's reluctance to respond. You're slightly high on glide path, came the LSO's voice. Looking good. At 100 feet, Jake could see the deck crew in their colored jerseys, all watching his approach. At 50 feet, he could see individual faces. At 30 feet, he could see the arrest cables. At 20 feet, he felt the aircraft enter ground effect. Cut, called the LSO. Jake pulled the throttles to idle and held back stick, flaring for touchdown. The main wheels hit the deck with a solid thump, and Jake felt the familiar jolt as the tail hook engaged the number 3 wire. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, going from 150 miles per hour to zero in less than 300 feet. Jake sat in his cockpit for a moment, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. "Rebel 204, welcome aboard," came the air boss's voice. "Nice flying." 20 minutes later, Jake sat in the ready room with Viper and the other squadron pilots. The storm was still building outside, and flight operations had been suspended. "Single-engine carrier landing in a storm," said Commander Hawk Rodriguez, the squadron skipper. "That's not something they teach you in the training command." Jake nodded, still processing what had happened. "I couldn't have done it without Viper's coaching." Viper smiled. "You did the flying. I just reminded you of what you already knew." "But how did you know what to say? How did you stay so calm?" Viper was quiet for a moment. "Because 12 years ago, I was in your position. Single-engine emergency, night landing, rough seas. My lead pilot talked me down, just like I talked you down today." She looked around the ready room at the younger pilots. "That's how it works in naval aviation. We look out for each other. We pass on what we've learned. And when someone needs help, we're there." Jake understood. The voice on the radio wasn't just guidance. It was the accumulated wisdom of every pilot who'd come before, passed down through generations of naval aviators. "The thing about emergency landings," Viper continued, "is that they're not really about the emergency. They're about everything that comes before: the training, the preparation, the trust in your aircraft and your shipmates." She looked directly at Jake. "Today you proved you belong here, not because you didn't make mistakes, but because you recovered from them. Not because you weren't scared, but because you did your job anyway." 6 months later, Jake was leading student pilots on their first carrier qualification cruise. The weather was perfect: clear skies, calm seas, light winds, textbook conditions. But Jake remembered his first emergency landing, and he knew weather could change quickly at sea. He also knew that somewhere in his formation was a pilot who would face their own moment of truth. "Rebel flight, this is Rebel 204, he called over the radio. "Remember, we're a team up here. We look out for each other. And if anyone needs help, speak up. We've all been there." As they approached the carrier for their first landings, Jake thought about Viper's words. Naval aviation wasn't just about flying. It was about the unbroken chain of knowledge and experience that connected every pilot who'd ever landed on a carrier deck. And now Jake was part of that chain, ready to pass on what he'd learned to the next generation of naval aviators who would face their own storms at sea. Every profession has its heroes, but few forge them under conditions as demanding as naval aviation. In a world that often celebrates individual achievement, naval aviation reminds us that our greatest accomplishments come when we support each other. Look for opportunities to be someone's voice of experience. Share your knowledge. Guide others through their storms. Because someday when you're facing your own emergency landing, you'll need someone to talk you down too.